on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Over the past 5 months, small-scale enthusiasts like myself have been rejoicing as the new core class returns to the roots of what Legends class was initially meant to be. Sure, they may or may not be designed to be compatible with the upcoming arc, and given the recent reveals, I'm leaning towards the latter, but what they offer on their own as their own unique experiences can be boiled down to Legends, but with that extra bit of pizzazz. With the exception of old giant Truckman over here, or I guess he's not that giant anyway, they've all been incredibly creative with their transformations. Although so far we only know that to be true with the first wave and that side buzzworthy Bumblebee release. I mean, that's a core class figure, we all know it is. As the line progresses though, in fact as any line progresses, it's important to push the envelope and try new and exciting things. You cannot just ride the coattails of the first few waves. Earthrise tried that and it led to a lot of its mediocrity. Right away from the promotional photography, I knew this was going to be an incredibly interesting wave, but I did have my concerns. So to either put said concerns to rest or to stoke the fires of criticism, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Kingdom Core Class WFC K12 Starscream and WFC K13 Megatron. One major selling point of Core Class Optimus Prime, at least when they announced him, was the similarities to the Earthrise leader version, or I guess the Kingdom version these days. Thanks Repacks. Granted, that idea ended up being a detriment to the design, especially in the vehicle mode department, but it was a thing that they marketed and I can't imagine it was all that unsuccessful. Now take these two of the most controversial molds in Earthrise. These are the bases for Megatron and Starscream. Right off the bat this is concerning. Prime turned out mediocrely and he was drawing from one of the best Prime toys of the decade. What chance do these two have when taking inspiration from those two undercooked wankers? Well, things aren't looking good for Megatron to start off with, or at least it seems that way. It's a pretty rough tank mode, all things considered. Much like the Optimus that preceded them, he's supposedly based off the Earthrise version, but aside from some slight tooling callbacks on the front slope, there's not a lot here that really evokes that style. In fact, if we're going for wholly accurate tank modes, there's not a lot that evokes such at all. The worst offender easily has to be the turret. Sure, there's a bunch of other issues that this figure has, but given the size, you can give a little more leeway. The turret though, so much is wrong with it. It's ridiculously huge for the size, to the point where Warpath ends up looking realistic. Legitimately, it makes the whole figure feel like its proportions are What draws your attention the most in terms of its dimensions is how far forward it sits. The front of the tank isn't allowed any room to show off its mechanical detail thanks to how much it gets covered up. The front of the turret does look pretty neat, but it tapers off to the back thanks to how the arms transform. And sure, beyond that are other issues, but they pale in comparison to how bad this looks. Sure, there's a bunch of hollowness between the turret and the base, but given the price point, I can't be too harsh. Don't make me pull out the sign again. And yes, the back section is pretty messy, but again, 20 bucks. That sign is itching for a showing here. No, these issues are fine in the grand scheme of things. The turret though, Jesus, what a letdown. Honestly, it makes this alt mode look like trash from a cursory glance. There's a lot here that looks f***ing amazing, but it gets overshadowed by how lazy this section is. They couldn't even get the fusion cannon to blend in properly. I get what it's a callback to, but those versions managed to fit in far more smoothly. And yes, those were $50 figures, where this is most certainly not, but we've seen truly masterful engineering at this size class, so it's a little below par. And it's not that difficult to get a tank to work at this size. Hasbro's been able to do such several times, sometimes at even half the price. That being said, all of this messiness does pay off. I can't deny that looks-wise, Megatron falls short, but they make up for this through the magnificent use of tank articulation. Like, the turret rotation itself would have been a bold new step forward for the size class, but adding an upward tilt, as far as I can gather, that's only been seen once, not counting the Micromasters who cheat by shoving it into the backpack. And out of those examples, it's always one or the other, never both. Through this playability, Megatron turns from a pretty lackluster tank into a pretty substantial artillery unit. Mayhaps one you can crash into the mobile house while you're at it. It's a toy that sacrifices everything for play options, and you know what? For that, I can really commend it. Sure, you might call me a shill for deliberately shifting my perspective on what he is just to get more enjoyment out of him, but this doesn't feel like a soulless cash grab, which was the feeling I got from Core Class Optimus. Core Class Prime was definitely the more solid out of these two, but he played it far too safe in my books. Megatron gives me way more fun as a toy, and ultimately that's what Legends and similar transformations should do. They're fun desk toys at the end of the day, and at least the designers had their priorities straight with this release. Also, side note, the cannon may not be the best, but that's because it's actually an approximation of Megatron's Walther P38. It even works with both 3mm and 5mm hands, although for the latter the mass shifting's a little off since he's ridiculously tiny. To tank nerds, this may seem stupid, but honestly I can't get mad at it. People have been asking for something like this for years, and let's face it, even though it looks far superior, unless you're happy with settling for moldery casts like I was, you're not getting the one from the accessory pack. But yes, this is very much something I approve of, and it should keep the niche fans happy. If not, and if they keep asking for a mainline $50 realistic Lupin the Third gun, then they might as well f*** off. Still, it's little details like this that make it clear that this was a labor of love, as opposed to trash that was shit out to fill the wave. And beyond that, there are plenty of elements to like. The mechanical detail is phenomenal, probably the best of the entire size class. The paint on the treads is absolutely stunning, and the deco on the whole does a good job of tricking your eyes into thinking it uses gunmetal paint. It doesn't, it just uses unpainted plastic, but it's done really well. And above all else, as I've said, it's just really fun to mess with. It's got a feel that can't be conveyed in photos, as unfortunate as that may seem. If you're a collector who cares deeply about the accuracy of their alt modes, maybe the Universe 2008 G3 Legends version will be more up your alley. But if you're into the tactile nature of figures like I am, then ultimately this is a pretty decent mode. Still, I can't deny that Starscream ends up being far better in the end, given that he succeeds in both the visual and tactile categories. He's fun to play with by default, given it's always a joy swooshing a jet around.
Oh, hello there!
But is also incredibly well designed. Matter of fact, it's probably the best vehicular alternate mode of the size class. Sure, he may be doing so by default, and he definitely pales in comparison to the beautiful sculpt work of the beasts, but it's a pretty damn good Starscream nonetheless. Of course, like every other G1 styled core class figure, he rips the design from Earthrise, and it's about the same in terms of quality. Don't get me wrong, there are differences in individual aspects, but the overall level of quality remains pretty close. The nose cone is definitely worse, as even though it's perfectly satisfactory, categorically they can't put clear plastic on the thing, and as such the Earthrise version takes the cake. Same with the feet. The vent feet was one of my favourite aspects of the original, even though I didn't like the mold overall. Of course, there's no way they could have added it into this design, so you get these huge chunks on the back. On the other hand, the profile ends up being surprisingly better. Instead of doing the traditional torso flip over, they've decided to engineer this transformation from the ground up. Yes, this does mean you get stuck with faux parts, which to some people may seem but to me, I reckon it's fine, and consequently the profile is actually far sleeker than the original. Plus the red paint is also far more durable. LOL. And oh look, the null rays actually remain in place during transformation. You don't have to remove them. This isn't something that I technically considered a flaw with the original per se, but the fact that they went out of their way to ensure you didn't have to really speaks to my sensibilities. I mean, you know me, I'm the guy with a near allergic reaction to unnecessary parts forming, especially with
The bastard! I warned you if you'd ever do something like that again, there'd be consequences!
Last episode, do you seriously think this show has any continuity? Oh, no! Lord, what the fuck are you doing? No, stop that, you bastard! My head.
I warned you there'd be consequences, so I've taken that which you hold so dear.
Get back here!
Of course, colour-wise, there is a bit of that pizzazz missing. The plastic is closer to the Sea rendition than that of the Earthrise, going for a lighter and as such far less vibrant grey. Yes, grey can be vibrant. Shut up. The wings are also far more minimalist, to the point where I feel that repro labels are far closer to being mandatory. With the Earthrise rendition, it was fine on its own, but here I feel something's missing. But even then, there's plenty of mechanical detail, and the paint here is super durable. In the end, categorically, the alt mode is on the same level as what it's inspired by. It's a case of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Pros and cons basically get swapped out between the two, but on a biased, free quality analysis, they're much of a muchness. But I still think I prefer the core class one. Throwing objectivity out the window, I typically prefer Legends vehicle modes. They hit me right in that sweet nostalgia spot, given that's what I primarily collected as a kid. And even beyond that, I find it difficult to enjoy the Earthrise one as much, since I know he turns into a big disappointment of a robot mode. Plus, you know, leaving him on a desk causes the paint to evacuate the area like Scott Morrison during a national crisis.
You know, this whole problem could have been avoided if they just, I don't know, added some landing gear. I mean, on a Legends figure, it's fine, but on a Voyager, it's really something you look forward to. Again, I don't hate this figure, but it is incredibly disappointing.
Core class Starscream is extremely solid in this mode, and I don't just mean that in a physical sense. He's got an effortless charm that gives him the impression that a senior designer worked on him. I respect what Megatron does more, as risk-taking will always be more interesting to me, but Starscream is just categorically better. Not gonna lie, this is the first time since the Tetrajet molds that I've been truly excited to see more of these. Too bad milking this mold is extremely unlikely, considering they're still driving the lukewarm predecessor into the ground, plus the new Studio Series hotness is apparently getting his own armada.
Show us thrust, you cowards!
Plus the True King is still getting some love, so sadly between those three, well, 4 if you count the upcoming Masterpiece, I don't see this getting anything outside of the main trio. Jeez, it's a wonder I'm not getting Seeker Fatigue at this point. I sure as hell am getting that for Optimus. Anyway, size-wise, there's not much to say here, other than the fact that Megatron is pretty wide for the class. And as for declaring the winner alt mode for the wave, I think it's pretty obvious. As good as Megatron is, he still comes second last in the rankings due to the haphazard nature of the parts on his design. Not all of it, just certain elements. Still, an artillery mode with this much playability coming in at the second to last spot really shows the quality of the line, and also really shows how useless the Optimus Prime is. Still holding out for that potential Magnus armor, since it doesn't seem like these buggers scale with the last Arc boss after all. Starscream though, well, he makes his home right between Bumblebee and Vertebrake. It's not his fault, the beasties are just that good in their beast modes. But of course, that's just the alternate mode rankings. As I've said many times, there are 3 parts to every Transformer. Well, at least 3. Triple and higher changes are a thing, but that's beside the point. The point is you gotta do well in all 3 categories. Granted, people keep telling me I'm crazy because the only category worth anything is apparently shelf presence, to which I usually facepalm right into my skull, but, well, you know what, this analogy is going on far too long. The point is the transformation and the robot mode have to be good, so here we go. The key idea we've seen with these recent core class figures is taking existing transformations and breathing new life into them. Whether it's transformations we've seen in the size class before, or whether you have transformations that are based on their larger counterparts. Megatron falls squarely into the latter category, loosely basing his transformation off the Siege/Earthrise rendition, but making a few refinements to ensure that it works at the scale. First thing you want to do is remove this gun from here. We'll put this to the side because it will have a place to go later. First thing you want to do is untab the legs from the side there. Then this is really cool. You've got a double hinge that rotates around, but it's a crooked double hinge, so as it folds in, it completely covers up the leg. So there's no hollowness here whatsoever. That's really, really cool. It's something I wouldn't mind seeing on full-sized Deluxe and Voyager figures. Anywho, much like the fully sized Deluxe, this opens up, and because it's plugged into there, it won't come off on that side, it'll only come off on that side. You've got these rotations that rotate outwards. Bring this front part forward a bit, and that'll give you enough clearance to push these into place. And then you rotate this all the way down into the back, and it'll lock into place. Now, if it's not all the way down, you may notice that the arms are coming loose pretty easily. So what you want to do is make sure these are in, and then pull this all the way down. Make sure it's all the way down. The further down it is, the more solid the shoulders become. Anyway, you rotate the waist like so. Wait, what the f***? Waist swivel on a Legends class figure. And they've engineered it into the transformation to make sure that the budget wouldn't be able to remove it. That's awesome. What else is awesome is that you rotate the fusion cannon around, and then you rotate the wrist around. So one wrist does have a wrist swivel for the transformation, so that this remains on the right side whilst that goes there. So again, you don't get any parts forming weight. I probably shouldn't say that for obvious reasons. Of course, this one just rotates around, but that is so clever. Oh, and I forgot to film this earlier, but you actually plug the pistol into the back of the backpack, so he looks like he's got the silhouette from the G1 toy. Or I guess also the G1 cartoon, but he does that. This guy really does have a fantastic transformation for the size. A lot of those caveats with the vehicle mode make a lot more sense once you realize what they've done with the engineering. That said though, yeah, Starscream's just the better figure. He's much more refined. His transformation doesn't do as much interesting, although it does interesting stuff thanks to the faux parts here, but it's just a blast, an absolute joy to go through. You might be wondering, how the hell does this transform if it's covering up the legs like that? Well, funny thing, the first thing you want to do is untab it from here. They're actually tabbed into these little slots here with the pegs there, and the whole thing just untabs like so. You can then bring the feet down like so, just so we've got a bit more clearance for later. Bring the head down like that, so we've got some space. Then take the nose cone section and just extend it and fold it down like so, so we have enough clearance for the whole chest section to rotate around. Then you can rotate it upwards, still fully extended, although while I'm doing this, you may notice that the null rays keep falling off. That's one thing I find a bit annoying. The tolerances on these are a bit skewed. Don't know why they're like that, it's incredibly annoying. But moving on, first thing you want to do is move the nose cone around like that, or I guess the next thing you want to do. Again, make sure this is fully extended and bring down the legs. Rotate the head first before pushing it up, otherwise you're going to have a lot of trouble getting in there. And then this is really cool, you rotate and collapse the entire chest together. And there goes the null ray again. Fantastic. This is something I always forget to do. You want to fold in this side wing here and then rotate it down like that. There's actually locking mechanisms in both parts here, so it remains in place. And at least these wings don't get attached to an ankle tilt, so they stay in place and don't make the design look weird. And last but not least, the arms are pegged into the side there. You've got a slot there and a peg there. You want to untab that and rotate the arm around into place, and of course the same on the other side. And of course, if you'd like, you don't have to, but if you'd like, you can rotate the wings back. They do kind of go with this weird locking mechanism, so it's either really ridiculously back or only a little bit of the way back. Would have preferred if the wings were a bit smoother, so you got a bit more range on them, but it gets the job done. Ultimately, I'm really glad they went with the faux parts route, because that is an incredibly interesting and unique transformation for a Seeker, and given the engineering required to make a traditional Seeker transformation work at this scale, well, I don't think that was feasible, so this is a very smart decision. So yes, I guess Starscream does buck the trend of borrowing transformation schemes from the original. I mean, I guess that's the same, but everything else is different. But both of these are truly fun to mess around with, and as I keep saying, that is what is key with designing a Legends figure. If it's not fun, why bother? These are desk toys. Sure, you can display them, but that's not their primary primary function. And that's why I prefer these two figures over Optimus Prime. Yes, he's a functional figure, but it's not a fun one. The transformations were actually the part that I was the most concerned about when I was going into this. For this wave, anyway. But this has put my worries to rest immensely. So the one consistent with this size class, at least as far as the 80s cast is concerned, is their connection to the Earthrise counterparts. You know it, I know it, we both know it because I've been hammering it into your heads for the whole video. Well, Bumblebee is a bit of an outlier, but that's because he might actually be Bumblejumper. But the point still stands. Until you get to Megatron. This is not the Earthrise version, at all. In fact, bringing in both of the War for Cybertron molds shows that he shares no real similarities in terms of sculpting, aside from the fact that the treads end up on the back. Matter of fact, I've got no idea what he's based on, if he is indeed based on anything at all. I've seen people compare him to MPO5, but from photos I really can't see anything similar. Yes, I can't compare the real thing because nobody in their right mind owns an MPO5, especially in Australia, given it's part of the reason we have replica firearm laws in the first place, but from what I've seen there's not a lot of comparisons to be made. In fact, in my stupidity, I double-checked both DX9 Mitron and Make Toys Despotron just to be 100% sure it didn't share any DNA from them. I can see a few similarities with the latter, but it's probably coincidental. More likely than not, this is a wholly original design, and you know what? It really works for it. Sure, I love the Siege design, but given the engineering required for the scale, I'm not sure it would have worked very well. And even then, you know they would have gone with the Earthrise version just for shits and giggles. They didn't do that because the end result is quite lush. The head sculpt does a remarkable job of capturing Megatron stylings, and it's probably a standout of the size class. Yeah, the eyes are a smidge big, but overall it's a pretty good job. The chest below is also pretty neat, showing some lovely layering effects, and I'm really glad they put emphasis on the red zones, even if he lacks the red sleeves. The leg engineering works insanely well, allowing them to cover up the hollowness almost seamlessly while still retaining the full range of motion. Not even the treads get in the way, and again, the treads look awesome. Love the silver paint. Also, nice job on the fusion cannon. Sure, it could be a little more cohesive, given the rest of the design is a little boxier, so they could have squared it off to match the aesthetic, but on its own, it's not bad. Maybe a locking mechanism would have been nice, but we do have budgets to consider, and such may have messed with the artillery mode. And you want to know my favorite part? Look, mate! Waist swivel on a Legends release. This isn't the turret swivel either. They fully engineered it into the transformation and articulation. Now that's commitment. So, wonderful sculpt work, brilliant silver chest paint. Oh yeah, the paint's pretty good too, I guess. Awesome proportions, fantastic head sculpt for the size. What more could you ask for? Well, better backpack, I guess. Now, I get it. There's feasibly no way they could have fixed this with the size and budgets they were given. And even then, there are plenty of awesome things this figure does to balance itself out. I've seen people say that this single factor ruins the whole experience, and seriously, no it doesn't. It does make the figure feel a little less premium though, especially when the other examples have handled their back kibble in far more cohesive ways. Yes, even Rat Trap. I feel I could be a little more forgiving if these treads at the back were filled in, and I'm still hoping someone does a back filler for these as it wouldn't affect the transformation at all, but it's still annoying. Usually I don't take issue with backpacks. As annoying as they can be in some cases, they're a necessary part of Transformer design, especially when it comes to Megatron. But I don't know, this still bugs me. Like with this aspect altered, he might have ended up as a contender for the top 21 list, but as it stands, it's just a solid release. Well, I suppose I shouldn't say just in this instance, because he is still quite good. Much like the rest of the line, this design embodies the delicate balance between risk versus reward, and this is a release that paid off immensely. I can see where this figure was trying to go initially, and I can tell when that idea was thrown out the window in favor of something much more fitting for the scale. They let this figure be what it was meant to be, and as such, I'm incredibly happy with the results. Starscream though, man, this guy just knocks it out of the park. If you told me last year that one of my favorite new Legends figures in 2021 would be in some part inspired by the deeply disappointing Earthrise rendition, I'd have probably punched you in your face. But here we are, and here he is. The DNA is fairly clear this time. A good chunk of detail, especially in the limbs, is pretty much one-to-one. The legs are a dead ringer, right down to the placement of the wings on the side. Sure, the knees are a little flatter, but that's where the undercarriage on the jet works better. So even if you're a die-hard Earthrise Seeker fan, I doubt you'd be able to complain. The arms too, right down to the fake blast ports on the forearms. Gotta say, that's pretty funny. And sure, the null rays are a little more squared off than the originals to account for the blast effect, but I think it adds a little more charm in comparison. Even the wing detail matches up, something you never really see given the arms are in the way, but hey, they did it. Oddly enough, the primary differences that this design presents are all in the middle section. The further out you go, the closer to the Earthrise model you get. These changes have, mixed results. First off, the head takes a massive departure, and it is completely and utterly trash. Legitimately, this has to be one of the worst small-scale head sculpts I've seen in a very long time. And sure, heads are very difficult to get right at this scale, but they've done it right 4 out of 5 times already, and even then the 5th wasn't this bad. This looks closer to something that Impossible Toys would put out. You know, that horrible third-party company that popped up in the infancy of the niche and exploded into obscurity because their figures were terrible. They probably ended up in the same pit as Zovran. Mushed lips aside, it's way too tall. Had they squished it a bit and beefed it out much like the Earthrise version, it could have worked amazingly. There are many things I will criticize the Earthrise version for, but the face sculpt isn't one of them. That said, this is the only real thing the Earthrise version has over this this one, because moving down to the chest reveals a staggering difference in design philosophy. Now, right off the bat, I'm aware that a lot of people are going to be turned off by the inclusion of faux parts, but honestly, I find that this is a much better way of doing things than what Earthscreamer pulled off. The key thing here is that it's not whether a transformation uses faux parts or not, it's about what's required of the transformation and what works out better in the end. Kingdom Starscream proudly displays his nose cone, whereas Earthrise pushes it far back into the torso and covers it up with this bridge section, to the point where you can barely even see it. Sure, the Earthrise version has much more pronounced turbines with blast effect nipples, but the Kingdom fans feel like they fit with the design more. And yes, the detail below is very similar to the original, but the overall body shape flows much more naturally. And yes, the yellow paints will never compare to the luscious clear plastic of the OG nose cone, but the red here doesn't just look more vibrant, but as mentioned earlier, doesn't chip to hell. Seriously, the Earthrise version keeps getting worse as the months go by, whereas this version actually encourages me to play with it. And beyond that, I guess the pylons have changed too in order to be closer to the cartoon. Honestly, I kind of prefer the older design, but I can also see why people would prefer this system. Everyone's got their own personal preference, and that leaves the rest of this robot mode doing laps around his Voyager counterparts. Even the proportions outclass him, with a slightly elongated torso and much better arms, since they don't have to fold up into that tiny torso gap. I think the main difference between the two is that the Earthrise version is a series of stupid decisions, whereas the Kingdom is a series of smart ones. The designers knew what to keep the same and what to change, instead of ham-fisting a then 14-year-old transformation scheme into a toy that just wasn't designed for it. This figure reminds me a lot of the New Age version. He's still quintessentially Starscream, but the designers realized that things needed to be done differently. They both do things you'd never expect to see on a mold like this. Once again, this is the first time in ages that I've been truly excited to see more versions of this. It's a shame we likely won't get them, but this is at the very least going to make a killer main 3, even if we know they'll likely end up being absurdly difficult to come by in stores. I both love and hate the current state of collecting. Anyway, his articulation is pretty standard for the size class. The only thing I could really complain with is that the knee ball joints won't rotate until the knee is bent a substantial amount. It's something that can easily be worked around, but it is annoying. Definitely not something that makes me hate this figure though. If there would be one thing I could change for future releases in other colors, it would be the tolerances on the null rays. These things constantly pop off, even when you're not doing any crazy poses. I can't imagine it's something that would take too much trouble to fix, and given all the complaints, I'm sure that Hashtag will have resolved this issue by the time Fundy and Squawper turn up. So I suppose that leaves us with comparisons. Well, aside from size comparisons. I mean comparisons between the two to see which one is ultimately the better figure. I think in the end, while I love all the risks that Megatron takes and believes he deserves far more respect overall, Starscream is the better figure. The maturity in his design cannot be understated, and it's probably for the best that they gave this design more time in the other than the other. This is the guy who's going to be redone several times, whether they go nuts or not. So they needed to get him right at the start. They didn't once, and we saw how that divided the fandom into two distinct groups. This should bring people back together, showing them what true Seeker engineering can do. But that doesn't make Megatron a bad figure. He has issues, don't get me wrong, but he is still immensely fun. If you're the kind of person who can look past the aesthetic issues, then you'll find a lot of play value in this $20 package. The designers put fun factor above all else, and although that causes some issues, he is still well worth it for any Legends collector and anyone who just has a passing interest in him. Starscream though, mate, if you've been looking for a brilliant Legend scale, affordable Starscream, then this is the time to jump on. Cast aside your biases against faux parts and embrace the quality engineering he presents. Go out and grab one right now. Or don't, maybe you're waiting for the right color scheme to come along. One thing I've learned over the years with this channel, doesn't matter how good a Starscream is, some people prefer it in black and purple, or blue and grey, or whatever colors you're into. And that's okay. This release shows that they've gotten it right the first time around, so those eventual redecos will be based on a solid core, as opposed to f***ing up the first time round and fumbling around like a reviewer without his posters. I'm not gonna lie, I was skeptical as f*** about these new releases. I thought this was going to be a noticeable dip in quality from the first wave. I thought the core class had peaked too early. But these two have shown me that Hashtag is committed to the Legends class again. They're committed to bringing consistent quality releases across the board. And as such, I for one couldn't be happier. So, bring on Wave 3. Let's see what Hasbro has in store for us. Let's see what fantastic journeys lie ahead. No!